The office smelled like stale coffee and failure. So familiar now, I barely noticed. It was 6:30 in the morning, and I sat alone at my desk staring at the sad 7-Eleven cupcake I'd bought myself last night. $2.49 for a tiny melting vanilla lump with one bent candle I'd found in my drawer. Pathetic, but the idea of spending my 50th birthday completely unacknowledged had felt worse than wasting the money I didn't have. 50. The age when you're supposed to be stable, successful, preparing for retirement, not living in your office, rationing gas for a rental car, and showering at a 24-hour gym. 25 years of work, and everything I'd built had collapsed. I didn't even light the candle. There was nothing left to wish for. The door opened without a knock. Joanna never knocked anymore. Boundaries had died long before our marriage did. She stepped inside in her usual power armor. Gray suit, black heels, jaw set like stone. Not a trace of warmth on her face, only finality. She looked like someone delivering a verdict. "Happy birthday," she said, voice flat. She dropped a stuffed manila envelope on my desk. The thud echoed. My stomach dropped. For one stupid second, I wondered if it might be a gift. A gesture, a memory of who we once were. But I knew better. I'd known better for a long time. "What's this?" I asked. "Freedom," she said. "For both of us. Mostly for me." My hands shook as I opened the envelope. 30 neatly printed pages, high-quality paper, tabs, a law firm's return address. And then the title came into focus like a blade. Petition for Dissolution of Marriage. Filed 3 days ago. She'd been walking around knowing our marriage was already over and had waited until my 50th birthday to tell me. Cruel. Precise. "You're joking," I whispered. "This is some shock tactic?" "Do I look like I'm joking?" she said, voice like ice. "Look at me. I'm done, Michael. Completely done." "We've been married 15 years," I said weakly. "We have a daughter." 15 years too long," she cut in. 15 years of your spiraling, of bad choices, of watching you pick that failing business over your family. Her voice tightened. "You're broke. You're living in your office, showering at a gym, eating gas station food. You're 50 and you have nothing left but debt and excuses." She stared at me, pity in her eyes, somehow worse than anger. "You're old," she said quietly. "You're nothing, and I'm not letting you drag me down anymore." The words landed harder than the envelope. And just like that, on my 50th birthday, she ended our marriage. I stood up, my legs weak beneath me, my whole body trembling with a combination of shock and anger and grief that I couldn't quite sort out. The fold-out chair scraped loudly against the floor, a harsh sound in the quiet office. "What about Emily?" My voice cracked as I said our daughter's name. "What about our daughter? Have you thought about what this will do to her? She's only 13 years old, Joanna. She's at that age where she needs stability, where she needs both of her parents. You can't just tear our family apart because you're unhappy." "Emily deserves better than watching her father fail," Joanna said, and there was something almost like genuine emotion in her voice now, though whether it was concern for our daughter or just more judgment of me I couldn't tell. "She deserves better than seeing you like this every day, living in an office, wearing the same clothes 3 days in a row, showing up to her school events looking like you slept in your car. She deserves stability. She deserves a parent who has their life together, who can provide for her properly, who can give her the kind of future she's entitled to." She turned toward the door, clearly done with this conversation, ready to leave me with the wreckage of our marriage and move on with her life. "My lawyer will be in touch, Patricia Holbrook. You should probably Google her. She's very good at what she does. You'll hear from her by the end of the week about the logistics. You have 30 days to move out of the house. That should give you enough time to find somewhere else to sleep that isn't your office, though God knows where you think you're going to go given your current financial situation." "The house?" The words came out louder than I intended, echoing in the small space. "That's my house. I bought that house. I worked 80-hour weeks for 3 years to afford the down payment on that house. We picked it out together. You spent 6 months looking at properties before you found the one you liked. Emily took her first steps in that house. Her bedroom is in that house. That's our family home, Joanna. You can't just take it." Joanna paused at the doorway, looking back over her shoulder with an expression that was almost smug, like she'd been waiting for me to make exactly this argument so she could knock it down. "Actually, if you bothered to consult an attorney instead of just assuming you're right about everything like you always do, you'd know that according to California community property law, it's not your house. It's our house. 50-50. And I'm keeping it. The house, the cars, what's left in the savings account, which isn't much thanks to your catastrophically bad financial decisions, and your precious little business that's been bleeding money for 3 years straight. My lawyer says I'm entitled to all of it given your current instability and your demonstrated inability to maintain stable employment or provide adequately for your family." She opened the door, and I could see the hallway beyond, could see the early morning light coming through the windows at the end of the corridor, could see the normal world continuing on while mine collapsed. "Oh, and Michael," she paused, her hand on the doorframe, "you might want to think about getting a real lawyer instead of that overworked public defender you've been using. Patricia plays to win, and she doesn't lose cases. Not ever. She's going to eat you alive in court, and there's nothing you can do about it because you don't have the money to fight back properly." "You can't—" I started, but my voice failed me, the words dying in my throat. "I already did," Joanna said simply, matter-of-factly, like she was telling me she'd already done the grocery shopping or already paid the electric bill. "The papers are filed. The wheels are in motion. It's over, Michael. We're over. This marriage is over. Your life as you knew it is over. The sooner you accept that and move on, the easier this will be for everyone involved, especially Emily." She walked out, her heels clicking down the hallway, each step taking her further away from me, from us, from everything we'd built together over 15 years. She left the door open behind her, like she couldn't even be bothered to close it, like I wasn't worth that small gesture of finality, like I was already gone, already forgotten, already nothing. I stood there, completely alone in my office, holding divorce papers on my 50th birthday, feeling the weight of them somehow heavier than their actual physical mass. Through the open door, I could hear the normal sounds of the building waking up for the day, someone's printer starting up in an office down the hall, a phone ringing somewhere, the hum of the HVAC system kicking on, the distant sound of traffic on the street outside. Life going on as normal while my world disintegrated. While everything I'd spent 15 years building, my marriage, my family, my sense of myself as a husband and father, crumbled into dust. The cupcake's single candle had burned down to nothing while we'd been talking, had melted into a shapeless lump of wax that now sat hardening on top of the frosting, ruining even that small, pathetic gesture of birthday celebration. I looked at it. This stupid, sad $2.49 cupcake that was supposed to mark my 50th birthday, and suddenly I wanted to throw it against the wall, wanted to watch it splatter and destroy something, wanted to cause some kind of damage that was visible and real instead of this invisible internal collapse that nobody else could see. But I didn't. I just sat back down in my desk chair and stared at the divorce petition, reading through the first few pages with a growing sense of horror at how thoroughly Joanna's lawyer had documented my failure, how completely they'd built a case against me as a husband and father and functional human being. This was how my 50th birthday began, with divorce papers and a melted cupcake and the taste of ashes in my mouth. And I had no idea that this wasn't even close to rock bottom yet. That was still coming. Before we get into it, don't forget to like and subscribe. And hit hype to boost this episode. Drop a comment below with your city or country. I'm always curious where viewers are joining from. I hadn't always been this man sitting alone in a dying office with divorce papers in my hands and a ruined cupcake as my only birthday celebration. 25 years ago, I was someone completely different. 25 years ago, I was just another nameless, faceless kid from Riverside, California, trying to make something of himself against odds that seemed impossible. The son of a mechanic who barely made enough to keep the lights on in his garage, and a diner waitress who worked double shifts and came home at 2 a.m, smelling like grease and coffee and exhaustion that had seeped into her bones after 20 years of minimum wage plus tips. We lived in a small apartment in the part of town that nobody put in the tourist brochures, the part where the buildings were all the same shade of beige-brown and the parking lots were full of cars held together with duct tape and hope. I grew up understanding, in that deep, wordless way that kids understand these things, that money was always tight, that opportunities didn't just appear out of nowhere, that if I wanted something different than what my parents had, I was going to have to work for it myself, because nobody was going to hand me anything. So I did. I worked. God, did I work. I worked 3 jobs simultaneously to put myself through Riverside Community College, which was all my family could afford. I cleaned floors at an office building downtown, starting at 11 p.m. and working until 6 a.m, mopping miles of hallway and emptying hundreds of trash cans while most people slept peacefully in their beds. I'd push that industrial mop bucket up and down hallways that all looked the same, listening to music through cheap headphones that kept breaking, trying to stay awake, trying not to think about how this wasn't exactly what I'd imagined my life would be like. Then I'd go home to our apartment, shower quickly in the cold water. Hot water cost money and my parents needed to save wherever they could, and grab my textbooks and head out again. I delivered newspapers at dawn, driving a beat-up Honda Civic that I'd bought for $800 from a guy my dad knew, a car that burned oil and made concerning sounds whenever I went over 45 miles per hour. a car that I was never entirely certain would actually start on any given morning. I'd drive through empty streets in that pre-dawn darkness, throwing rolled-up newspapers onto driveways, watching the city slowly wake up around me, wondering if I'd ever actually escape this life, or if I was kidding myself, thinking I could be anything more than what my parents had been. After the newspaper route, I'd go to classes at Riverside Community College, sitting in classrooms that smelled like old coffee and desperation, fighting to stay awake through lectures on circuit theory and differential equations and electromagnetic fields. And then, in the afternoons and evenings, I'd study electrical engineering in between shifts, my textbooks covered in coffee stains and grease marks from hasty meals eaten while reviewing formulas I barely understood at first, but gradually began to see the patterns in, began to understand the elegant logic underlying everything. I was running on maybe 4 hours of sleep a night, sometimes less. I was existing on cheap food and cheaper coffee and sheer determination. I was 22 years old and felt like I was 40. My body ached constantly. My eyes burned from exhaustion. I had no social life, no girlfriend, no time for anything except work and school and sleep when I could manage to squeeze it in. But I kept going because the alternative, ending up like my parents, working brutal jobs for minimal pay for the rest of my life, was unacceptable. I'd decided I was going to make something of myself, and I'd internalized the idea that if I just worked hard enough, if I just sacrificed enough, if I just pushed myself past every limit, eventually it would pay off. That's where I met Henry during one of those impossible stretches when I was running on fumes and determination, wondering if I was actually going to make it or if I'd eventually collapse from exhaustion and end up right back where I started. Henry Caldwell was 63 years old when we first met, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from tree bark, calloused and strong and permanently stained from decades of working with tools and electronics and chemicals. He had eyes that seemed to see everything, that looked at you with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable at first, like he could see past whatever mask you were wearing and straight into who you actually were underneath. He owned a small electronics repair shop in downtown Los Angeles, a cramped little place called Caldwell's Electronics, that was wedged between a check-cashing place on one side and a Thai restaurant on the other. The sign above the door was one of those old neon signs from the 1960s, and most of the letters still worked, though the C flickered in an annoying way that Henry never bothered to fix. The shop itself was cluttered with old radios and television sets and computer parts and various pieces of equipment that most people would have thrown away decades ago, but that Henry insisted still had life in them if you knew what you were doing and were willing to put in the time to fix them properly. He hired me part-time to help with soldering work, paying me $12 an hour in cash that he'd count out from an old cigar box he kept under the counter. It wasn't much. It was barely above minimum wage at the time, but it was more than I was making at my other jobs, and more importantly, it was teaching me practical skills that would actually matter in the real world, rather than just theoretical knowledge from textbooks that might or might not have any connection to what people actually needed in their lives. The shop smelled like old electronics and solder flux, and Henry's pipe tobacco, this sweet cherry blend that he special ordered from some tobacconist in San Francisco who'd been making it the same way for 40 years. He'd smoke that pipe constantly while he worked, clouds of sweet-smelling smoke drifting through the shop, and even though technically you weren't supposed to smoke indoors in California by that point, nobody ever complained because it was Henry's shop, and he'd been smoking that tobacco there for longer than most of the building inspectors had been alive. "You're good with your hands," Henry said one afternoon, watching me carefully solder a connection on a circuit board for an old transistor radio that somebody's grandmother had brought in. She'd insisted it just needed a little fixing because it had belonged to her late husband, and she couldn't bear to throw it away, even though buying a new radio would have cost less than the repair. But Henry had taken the job anyway because he understood that sometimes objects have value beyond their monetary worth. Steady, precise. You don't rush. You take your time to do it right. "I just pay attention to what I'm doing," I said, trying to downplay the compliment because I'd grown up in a family where bragging was considered worse than failure, where you were supposed to be humble and understated and never think too highly of yourself. "Most people don't pay attention," Henry said, lighting his pipe with one of those old wooden matches he bought in bulk from a restaurant supply company, the flame briefly illuminating his weathered face in the dimly lit shop. "Most people just go through the motions, following instructions without understanding why they're doing what they're doing or what purpose it serves in the larger system. But you want to understand. You're not content to just follow a schematic. You want to know why the circuit is designed the way it is, what would happen if you change different components, where the failure points are likely to be." He puffed on the pipe, sweet smoke curling up toward the yellowed ceiling tiles that had probably been white once but were now stained brown from decades of tobacco smoke. You see patterns, you see systems, you see how everything connects together into a coherent whole. That's rare. That's valuable. That's the kind of thinking that builds things that last. He looked at me then, really looked at me, with that intense gaze that made you feel like he could see everything you were trying to hide, the exhaustion, the doubt, the fear that you weren't actually good enough to make it no matter how hard you worked. You're going to build something important one day, kid. I can feel it. I've been doing this work for 40-something years now, and I can recognize talent when I see it. You've got something special. You've got the gift. I laughed, the sound uncomfortable in the small workshop. Uncomfortable because I desperately wanted to believe him, but was terrified of hoping for something that might not happen. I'm just trying to get through next semester without failing thermodynamics and losing my financial aid. Building something important is a little beyond my current pay grade. Right now I'd settle for passing my classes and maybe getting more than 4 hours of sleep occasionally. You'll do more than that, Henry said with complete certainty, tapping his temple with one gnarled finger. You've got the gift. You see the world like a system, everything connected, everything fixable if you can just figure out which piece is broken and how to replace it or repair it. Most people see chaos when they look at complex problems. You see patterns, you see the underlying structure, you see how to take something apart and put it back together better than it was. That's rare. Don't waste it. Don't let exhaustion or doubt or fear convince you to settle for less than what you're capable of. Those words stayed with me through everything that came after. They echoed in my head during finals week when I was running on nothing but coffee and determination and wondered if my brain might actually explode from trying to cram too much information into it in too little time. They sustained me when my Honda Civic finally died completely one morning, just refused to start no matter how many times I turned the key, and I had to take 3 different buses to get to work and school, adding 2 hours to my commute each way. They gave me hope during those dark 3 a.m. moments when I'd be mopping floors and wondering if I was crazy for thinking I could make something of myself, if I was delusional for believing I could escape the life my parents had. Henry's words became a kind of mantra. You see patterns. You've got the gift. Don't waste it. 3 years later, I graduated from community college with honors, a 3.8 GPA that got me accepted to Cal State Fullerton with a partial scholarship that would cover tuition but not living expenses, which meant I'd still need to work to survive. 5 years after that, I had a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering and enough student loan debt to make me nauseous whenever I logged into my account and saw the balance, but I also had skills and knowledge and a portfolio of projects I'd completed and references from professors who believed in me. And then I did something crazy, something that my parents thought was insane, something that everyone told me was too risky. I started my own company from absolutely nothing, Apex Systems Integration. I maxed out 3 credit cards to buy my initial equipment, soldering stations and testing equipment and computers and software and all the tools I'd need. I worked out of a storage unit for the first 6 months, a 10x10 space that cost me $90 a month, with no climate control and no running water and barely enough room to turn around. I lived on ramen noodles and determination and this burning conviction that if I could just get one good contract, just one client who'd take a chance on me, I could build something real. The business model was simple. I designed security networks for office buildings, hotels, and eventually hospitals, systems that would keep people safe, that would work reliably for years, that would be elegant and efficient and better than what my competitors were offering. I undercut everyone on price at first because I had to, because nobody knew who I was and I needed to get my foot in the door. I worked insane hours, sometimes 70 or 80 hours a week, doing everything myself because I couldn't afford to hire anyone. And against all odds, against everything everyone had told me about how most small businesses fail in the first year, it worked. It actually worked. The business exploded beyond anything I'd imagined during those desperate early days. That first contract led to a second, which led to a referral to a third. Word spread that there was this young guy who did excellent work for reasonable prices and actually showed up when he said he would and finished projects on time. Within 3 years, I had 20 employees and an actual office building with my company name on the door. Within 5 years, I was pulling in revenue that would have seemed impossible to the kid cleaning floors and delivering newspapers. I bought a nice car, a German sedan that didn't make weird noises or burn oil, that had heated leather seats and a sound system that actually worked. I moved into a condo in Orange County with a view of the hills and a balcony, where I could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset and feel like I'd actually made it. I paid off my student loans in one lump sum, writing a check for $43,000 that represented years of debt, and immediately felt about 50 pounds lighter when I dropped it in the mail. I sent money to my parents so my father could finally retire from the garage that had slowly destroyed his back and his hands over 40 years, and so my mother could quit the diner where she'd been working double shifts since before I was born. For the first time in my life, I felt like I'd actually made it. Like all those years of struggle had been worth something. Like I'd proven everyone wrong who'd said I was dreaming too big or reaching too high or thinking I was better than I actually was. I met Joanna at an industry conference in San Diego, one of those massive events held at a waterfront hotel with 1,000 attendees, everyone wearing name tags and carrying canvas bags full of promotional materials they'd never look at. She was beautiful in a way that made me nervous, polished and confident and sharp. She had this perfect blonde hair that probably required expensive maintenance and regular salon visits, wore designer clothes that I couldn't identify by brand but knew were expensive based on how they fit and moved, and she navigated the conference with this ease that suggested she'd always belonged in places like this, that she'd never had to work 3 jobs or live in a storage unit or wonder if she'd have enough money for food next week. She worked in marketing for a tech firm, some company that did social media analytics for major brands, and she was good at it, successful at it in a way that was immediately apparent from how she carried herself and how other people responded to her. When she smiled at me across the hotel bar during the networking reception on the first night, when she actually approached me instead of waiting for me to approach her, I felt like I'd finally arrived at some invisible finish line I'd been running toward my whole life. "You look lost," she'd said, sliding onto the bar stool next to me with a glass of white wine in her hand. Expensive wine, I'd learn later, not the cheap stuff they were serving at the open bar. Up close, she was even more attractive, with these sharp green eyes that seemed to evaluate and approve of me simultaneously, and a smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room she wanted to talk to. Like you're not sure what you're doing here, or how you ended up at a networking event when you'd clearly rather be somewhere else. "I'm not really a conference person," I admitted, holding my beer a little awkwardly because I wasn't used to drinking in social situations, wasn't practiced at the casual confidence that seemed to come naturally to everyone else in the room. "I'm better with circuits and systems than I am with, people and small talk and pretending to be interested in strangers' business cards." "Then why are you here?" She smiled, and it seemed genuine, warm even, not the polite networking smile that everyone else seemed to have perfected. "That's a genuine question, by the way. I'm actually curious. You don't seem like the type who would voluntarily subject himself to 3 days of keynote speeches and networking receptions." "Someone told me I needed to network more if I wanted to grow my business," I said honestly, figuring there was no point in trying to pretend I was someone I wasn't. Something about how contracts don't just appear magically out of nowhere, and relationships matter in this industry, and I needed to get out there and schmooze, or whatever the official term is. So here I am, networking, or at least attempting to network, though I think mostly I'm just standing at this bar hoping nobody tries to sell me anything. She laughed, a real laugh that made her whole face light up and made her seem younger and more approachable, not the carefully controlled, polite laugh that was standard at these events. "I like honest people. There aren't enough of them in this industry. Everyone's always performing, always trying to impress someone or sell something or position themselves as more successful than they actually are. What do you do?" "I design security systems," I said. "Not the residential stuff, the big commercial installations, access control, surveillance integration, network security, that kind of thing. Hospitals, office buildings, hotels. Nothing particularly glamorous, but it pays the bills, and occasionally it's actually interesting." "Sounds interesting to me," Joanna said, and she seemed to actually mean it, seemed genuinely interested rather than just being polite. "I'm tired of marketing people talking about engagement metrics and brand awareness and conversion rates. Tell me about the most complicated system you've ever designed. What's the thing you're most proud of?" We talked for 3 hours straight that night, long after the official networking reception had ended and most of the other attendees had wandered off to the hotel restaurant or back to their rooms. We sat at that hotel bar while the bartender occasionally refreshed our drinks and gave us knowing looks, and I told her about the hospital security network I just completed in Long Beach, a massive project that had taken 18 months and had required integrating 17 different subsystems into one cohesive whole that actually worked reliably. Joanna told me about a campaign she'd run for a major athletic brand that had gone viral in ways they hadn't anticipated, generating millions of impressions and probably saving her job because her boss had been looking for reasons to replace her. She was smart, she was funny, she was ambitious in a way that I found attractive, because I understood that drive, that need to prove yourself, that hunger to be successful, and she seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say, which was a novelty for me at that point in my life. I was used to people's eyes glazing over when I started talking about network architecture and encryption protocols and electromagnetic interference, but Joanna actually engaged with it, asked intelligent questions, made connections to her own work that I hadn't considered. By the end of that conversation, I was half in love with her. Or at least I thought I was. Looking back now, sitting in my office 25 years later with divorce papers in my hands, I wonder if what I felt that night was actually love, or if it was just the intoxication of being seen by someone like her, of being found interesting by someone who seemed so far above my level. We were married within a year. It was a whirlwind courtship. Long phone calls every night, weekend visits that alternated between Orange County and San Diego, a level of intensity that felt romantic at the time, but in retrospect might have been a warning sign that we were rushing into something without really knowing each other. The wedding was at a winery in Temecula, a beautiful venue that Joanna had found and fallen in love with 200 guests, most of whom I barely knew because Joanna had a large extended family and a wide social circle, while I had maybe 15 people I actually cared about inviting. It was an expensive wedding, the kind of event that people took photos of and posted on social media with captions about true love and perfect days and happily ever after. Joanna's parents paid for most of it, thank God, because I couldn't have afforded even half of what it cost. They were wealthy doctors from La Jolla, who clearly had some reservations about their daughter marrying someone who'd grown up in Riverside and worked his way through community college, someone whose parents had worked blue-collar jobs their entire lives. But they were polite about their concerns, and they wrote the checks for the wedding planner and the catering and the open bar and the string quartet. Henry came to the wedding wearing a suit that looked like it was older than I was, a brown three-piece thing that had probably been fashionable in 1975 and had been carefully preserved in a garment bag ever since. But he cleaned up nicely, and he gave a toast during the reception that made half the guests cry, something about believing in people's potential and watching someone you care about grow into themselves, and the greatest joy of mentorship being to see your students surpass you. I saw Joanna's father dab at his eyes during that toast, and I felt a surge of gratitude toward Henry for being there, for being the father figure I needed since my own father was too uncomfortable in these fancy surroundings to do much besides stand in the corner and nurse a beer and talk to Henry about old cars. Emily was born 2 years later on a Tuesday morning in March, 3 weeks early because apparently she was impatient even in the womb, ready to get out into the world and start experiencing everything. She was 6 pounds, 4 ounces of pure miracle, this tiny red-faced creature wrapped in a hospital blanket who screamed her head off for the first 3 months of her life, and then suddenly, almost overnight, became the sweetest, happiest child imaginable, all smiles and giggles and joy. I fell in love with her immediately, completely, in a way I didn't even know was possible. I'd never really thought about being a father before Emily arrived. I'd always sort of vaguely assumed I'd have kids someday because that's what people did, that's what life was supposed to look like, but I hadn't given it much concrete thought. I'd been too focused on building my business, on proving myself, on escaping the poverty I'd grown up in. But the moment the nurse placed her in my arms, this tiny, perfect creature who was half me and half Joanna and entirely her own person, something fundamental shifted inside me. Suddenly I understood what people meant when they talked about unconditional love. Suddenly I understood why parents said they'd do anything for their children. Suddenly every cliché about parenthood made perfect sense because I was living it, because I was holding this small human who was utterly dependent on me and Joanna, and I made a silent promise to her in that moment that I would never let her down, that I would always be there for her, that I would work as hard as I needed to work to give her a better life than I'd had. If only I'd been able to keep that promise. For about 5 years, maybe 6 if I'm being generous, life was perfect, or at least as close to perfect as real life actually gets. The business continued to grow steadily year after year, adding employees and clients and revenue in a way that felt sustainable and earned. Emily grew from a helpless newborn into a toddler who could walk and talk, then into a bright, curious little girl who asked endless questions about how things worked and why the sky was blue and where the stars went during the daytime and whether electricity was alive because it moved through wires. I loved those questions. I loved how her mind worked, how she saw the world with this fresh perspective that made me reconsider things I'd always taken for granted. I taught her about circuits and systems in terms she could understand, letting her help me with simple projects in my home workshop, soldering connections under my close supervision, testing continuity with a multimeter, building small projects from kits. She was good at it, had the same instinct for seeing patterns that Henry had recognized in me all those years ago. I'd watch her concentrate on a task, her small tongue sticking out slightly as she focused, and I'd feel this overwhelming sense of pride and hope for who she might become. Joanna's career flourished during those years. She moved from her marketing firm to a better position at a startup that eventually got acquired by a major tech company, and suddenly she was a director managing a team of 20 people and landing increasingly high-profile clients. She was good at her job, talented at it in a way that was obvious to anyone who worked with her. She traveled frequently for work, conferences and client meetings and team retreats, and I supported that because I understood ambition, understood the drive to be successful, understood that sometimes you had to sacrifice time with family for career advancement, because that's how you provided for your family long term. We bought a house in Orange County, a 4-bedroom place with a pool in the backyard and a 2-car garage and a kitchen that Joanna spent 6 months renovating to get exactly right. She had very specific ideas about what she wanted: granite countertops in a particular shade, custom cabinets, high-end appliances, a professional-grade range that cost more than my first car. I went along with it because the business was doing well enough to afford it, and because I wanted her to be happy, wanted to give her the life she deserved after she'd taken a chance on me. We went on family vacations: Hawaii, Disneyland, the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, San Francisco, Seattle. We hosted dinner parties where Joanna would cook elaborate meals and I'd tend bar, and we'd entertain friends and business associates and generally act like we had it all figured out. We went to Emily's school events, back-to-school nights and parent-teacher conferences and performances where Emily played the triangle in the school orchestra or had 2 lines in the 3rd-grade play. We looked successful. We looked happy. We probably were happy, at least some of the time. Henry came to all the important events during those years. He came to Emily's baptism at the Catholic church that Joanna's family attended, even though Henry himself wasn't particularly religious, and spent most of the ceremony looking slightly uncomfortable with all the ritual and incense and standing, kneeling, sitting choreography that Catholics seem to thrive on. He came to Emily's first birthday party and gave her a toy robot that made lights and sounds and that she immediately dropped in her cake, which everyone thought was hilarious. He came to every one of Emily's birthday parties after that, always arriving with some thoughtful gift that showed he'd actually paid attention to what she was interested in. Books about how things work, science kits, building sets, tools adapted for small hands. He sat in the front row when I received the Small Business Award from the Orange County Chamber of Commerce, a fancy dinner at a hotel where I had to give a speech about entrepreneurship and job creation and giving back to the community and all the buzzwords that people in business seem to expect. I'd practiced that speech for weeks, terrified I'd embarrass myself in front of the 400 people who'd paid to attend this dinner. But when I got up to speak and saw Henry in the front row, sitting there in that ancient brown suit and giving me this small, encouraging nod, suddenly it was easier. I wasn't speaking to a room full of strangers anymore. I was just telling Henry about what I'd built and why it mattered. Afterward, at the reception where everyone stood around drinking wine and eating hors d'oeuvres and networking, Henry pulled me aside into a quiet corner. "Told you," Henry said, gripping my shoulder with one of those strong, calloused hands that still had decades of work embedded in them. "I told you that you'd build something real, something that matters, and you did. I couldn't have done it without you," I said, and I meant it with everything in me. Everything I know about actually running a business, about doing good work instead of just fast work, about treating people with respect and delivering on promises. I learned that from you. You're the only reason I'm standing here accepting this award instead of still cleaning floors somewhere. "Nah." Henry waved his hand dismissively, uncomfortable with the praise like he always was. "I just gave you a chance to prove yourself. I just saw what was already there waiting to come out. You did all the hard work yourself. All those nights studying, all those years building your business from nothing, all the risks you took, that was all you. I just held the door open a little. You're the one who walked through it." But Henry was getting older. It was undeniable, unavoidable, visible in ways that became more obvious with each visit. His hands shook more when he worked on delicate repairs, making it increasingly difficult for him to do the fine soldering work that had been his specialty for decades. His memory slipped in small ways that at first we all laughed off as normal aging, but gradually became more concerning. Forgetting where he'd put a tool, losing track of which day appointments were scheduled, occasionally calling me by the wrong name before correcting himself. He moved slower, more carefully, like his body was becoming something he couldn't quite trust anymore, like he had to think about each step to make sure his legs would cooperate. He'd sold the repair shop a few years earlier, finally admitting that he couldn't keep up with the work anymore, that his hands and his eyes and his memory weren't reliable enough to run a business. He'd sold it to a younger guy who'd worked for him for years, and from what I heard, the shop was doing well under new management. Henry himself lived alone in a small apartment in Anaheim, spending his days reading technical journals and working on personal projects, and occasionally meeting me for lunch at this diner we both liked that served breakfast all day, and had coffee strong enough to strip paint. And then one cold morning in February 2009, when the economy was in free fall and everyone was scared about the future, and it felt like the whole world might be coming apart. Henry died quietly in his sleep at 72 years old. A neighbor found him 3 days later when his newspapers started piling up outside his door. something Henry would never have allowed if he'd been alive, because he was fastidious about things like that, almost obsessive about maintaining his routines and keeping his life organized. Heart attack, the coroner said. Quick and painless, probably didn't even know what was happening. His heart just stopped sometime in the night, and he went from sleeping to not existing in a matter of seconds. I tried to take comfort in that, in the idea that Henry hadn't suffered, that he hadn't had to endure a long decline or a painful illness or months of knowing he was dying. But mostly, I just felt the absence of him, this gaping hole in my life where Henry used to be, where I used to be able to call him when I had a problem or needed advice or just wanted to hear his voice telling me I was doing okay. I went to the funeral. There were only a handful of people there, maybe 15 at most, scattered in the pews of a small chapel that Henry had apparently arranged to be held at, according to the lawyer who handled his estate. Henry had no wife, no children, no siblings who were still alive, no family anyone knew about. He'd lived alone, worked alone, and apparently had planned to die alone, though I suspected Henry wouldn't have phrased it that way. He probably would have said something about maintaining his independence and not being a burden to anyone and living life on his own terms, right up until the end. The service was simple and brief, and exactly what Henry probably would have wanted. No religious ceremony, since Henry had never been religious, just a few people standing up to share memories. I stood up and tried to explain what Henry had meant to me, how he'd changed my life, how I wouldn't be standing there in a suit that cost more than my monthly rent used to be if it weren't for Henry believing in me when I was nobody. I got through about 2 sentences before my voice cracked and I had to sit down, overwhelmed by the grief and the gratitude and the profound sense of loss. Afterward, standing outside the chapel in that weak February sunlight, Henry's lawyer approached me. Richard Summers was a thin man in his 60s, wearing a suit that had seen better days and carrying an old leather briefcase that was cracked and worn. He had the patient, careful manner of someone who dealt with grief and death as part of his job and had learned how to be respectful without being obtrusive. "Mr. Reeves," he said softly, waiting for me to acknowledge him before continuing. "I'm Richard Summers, Mr. Caldwell's attorney. I handled his estate planning. He left very specific instructions regarding his affairs, and there's something he wanted you to have." From his briefcase, Richard pulled out another briefcase, older, more worn, the kind of thing someone might have carried in the 1970s. It was heavy leather, dark brown that had faded to almost tan in places, with brass latches that had tarnished over the years to a dull greenish brown, and a handle that was cracked and wrapped with what looked like medical tape to hold it together. "He wanted you to have this," Richard said, his voice soft and respectful in the way lawyers who handle estates learn to speak around grief. He was very specific about it in his instructions, very insistent. When the time came, he said, this was to go directly to you and only to you, not to be opened by anyone else, not to be examined by the estate, just handed directly to Michael Reeves. I took it, confused, feeling the substantial weight of it in my hands. It felt important somehow, this old battered briefcase that Henry had kept and preserved and designated to be given to me. "What's inside? Did he say why he wanted me to have it specifically?" "I honestly don't know what's inside," Richard said, shaking his head. He sealed it himself, wouldn't let me examine the contents, said it was personal and private and not subject to estate inventory. There's a note attached to the handle. Richard gestured to a small tag tied to the handle with string, and I could see Henry's handwriting on it, that distinctive shaky penmanship that elderly people have when their hands don't quite work right anymore, when they have to concentrate hard just to form legible letters. I looked at the tag. In Henry's unmistakable writing were just a few words. "For Michael. Open when you're ready." I stared at those words. Open when you're ready. Ready for what? What was I supposed to be ready for? Ready to accept that Henry was gone? Ready to face some truth he'd been keeping from me? Ready for whatever life had in store next? The phrase was simultaneously clear and completely opaque, typically Henry in the way it seemed to mean something specific, but could be interpreted 100 different ways. I looked up to ask Richard what Henry had meant, what other instructions or explanations Henry might have left, but the lawyer just shrugged apologetically. "Your guess is as good as mine, son. Henry was a private man, as I'm sure you know. He didn't explain things unless he thought you needed to know them right then. He trusted people to figure things out when the time was right. Whatever's in that briefcase, he thought you'd understand it when you opened it. When you were ready, whatever that means. I wasn't ready that day. Wasn't ready at the funeral. Wasn't ready during the drive home. Wasn't ready during the wake at a restaurant Henry had apparently prepaid for, where 15 of us ate sandwiches and tried to share happy memories while the weight of Henry's absence pressed down on all of us. I wasn't ready that whole terrible week when I kept thinking I should call Henry about something and then remembering with a jolt of grief that I couldn't, that he was gone, that I'd never hear his voice again. I wasn't ready for months after that, as 2009 turned into 2010, and the economy slowly started to recover and life continued forward, with that relentless momentum it always has, regardless of who's no longer there to see it. I put the briefcase in my office closet at work and tried to forget about it, buried it under boxes and old client files and years of accumulated business detritus that everyone keeps meaning to organize and never quite gets around to dealing with. Life moved on, because life always does, whether you're ready for it or not. The business continued to grow even more during those years. Apex Systems became one of the top security integration firms in Southern California, with eventually 60 employees and contracts that I'd once only dreamed about. Major hospitals, airport terminals, government buildings, corporate headquarters. I was successful by any reasonable measure, making more money than I'd ever imagined possible when I was delivering newspapers at dawn 20 years earlier. Emily started school, going from kindergarten to elementary to middle school with that shocking speed that parents always comment on. That feeling that one day your kid is learning to tie their shoes and read simple books, and suddenly they're 13 years old and asking if they can stay out past 9 p.m., and interested in boys and rolling their eyes at everything you say. She was smart, got good grades without really trying, had friends and interests, and seemed generally happy. I tried to be present for her important moments, though I was working long hours and sometimes had to miss things because of business obligations. Joanna redecorated the house twice during those years, hiring interior designers and contractors and spending money that I tried not to think too hard about, because she seemed happy with the projects and the business was doing well enough to afford it. We bought a timeshare in Sedona that we used maybe 3 times total, one of those purchases that seems like a good idea at the sales presentation, but turns out to be a waste of money, because who actually has time for regular vacations when you're running a business and raising a child and trying to maintain a career? We bought new cars every few years, trading up because we could, because that's what successful people did, because having nice things was part of the image we were projecting to the world and to ourselves. We went to charity galas and industry events and became the kind of couple that other people looked at and thought, they really have it together. We were living the dream, checking off all the boxes that society tells you you're supposed to check off if you want to be considered successful. Nice house, successful careers, kid in a good school district, savings account, retirement accounts, vacation timeshare we never used, but that looked good on paper. Everything was fine. Everything was good. Everything was exactly what I'd worked so hard to achieve. Until it wasn't. Until the day everything started to unravel, slowly at first and then all at once. Like a sweater with one loose thread that someone keeps pulling until the whole thing falls apart, and you're left standing there holding something that used to be clothing and is now just a pile of yarn. The first crack appeared 3 years ago in 2022, though if I'm being completely honest with myself, which I'm trying to be now, sitting here in my office at 50 years old with divorce papers in my hands, the cracks had probably been there much earlier, and I just hadn't wanted to see them. I hadn't wanted to acknowledge that something fundamental was wrong, because acknowledging it would have meant dealing with it, and I'd always been better at working than at dealing with uncomfortable emotional realities. A major client, St. Catherine's Hospital, a massive medical center in Long Beach with over 400 beds and some of the most sophisticated medical equipment in California, sued Apex Systems for a security breach. Some hacker group from Eastern Europe, probably working from an apartment in Moldova or Ukraine, had gotten into their patient record system through what turned out to be a vulnerability in a third-party cloud storage service. They'd stolen data on about 12,000 patients. Names, addresses, social security numbers, medical histories, prescription records, all sorts of information that's worth good money on the dark web where identity thieves and insurance fraudsters pay premium prices for verified data. It wasn't my fault. It wasn't Apex's fault. The breach came from a third-party vendor, some cloud storage company called Secure Cloud Solutions, that the hospital's IT director had insisted on using despite my recommendations to use something with better security protocols. I'd actually documented my concerns in writing, sent emails specifically saying that their chosen vendor had known vulnerabilities and should be replaced, but the IT director had overruled me because Secure Cloud offered better pricing and because he had some kind of relationship with their sales rep. But none of that mattered to the hospital's lawyers. They wanted someone to pay, preferably someone with deep pockets and liability insurance and assets they could go after. And Apex Systems was the easiest target. We'd designed and installed the overall security system, even though this particular vulnerability wasn't something we had any control over or responsibility for, so we got named in the lawsuit along with Secure Cloud and about 6 other parties. The lawsuit demanded $15 million in damages, compensation for the breach itself, for the cost of notifying affected patients, for providing credit monitoring services, for hiring forensic analysts to determine the extent of the breach, for reputational damage to the hospital, for increased insurance premiums, for basically everything they could think of to maximize the potential settlement. My lawyer at the time, a guy named Marcus Chen, who I'd used for basic business legal work for years, took one look at the complaint and shook his head. "This is bad," he said, which was not what I wanted to hear. "This is really bad. You're going to need a specialist. This is beyond my expertise." He referred me to a defense firm that specialized in technology lawsuits, and suddenly I was dealing with lawyers who charged $600 an hour and wanted $20,000 just to take the case and another $30,000 for the initial response and investigation. My business liability insurance had a $500,000 coverage limit, which sounds like a lot until you're staring down a $15 million lawsuit, and suddenly I realized that insurance wouldn't be nearly enough if this went badly. The lawsuit dragged on for 18 months. 18 months of grinding legal warfare that consumed my life and my business and my marriage. Depositions where the hospital's lawyers asked me the same questions 50 different ways, trying to get me to admit something they could use against us. Interrogatories. Written questions that required detailed written responses that took weeks to prepare properly. Document requests where we had to produce every email, every design document, every piece of paper related to the hospital security system going back 5 years. Motions and hearings and mediation sessions and expert witness reports. The legal fees piled up like snow in a blizzard, steady and relentless and suffocating. $50,000 for the initial response and discovery planning. Then $80,000 more for the document production and initial depositions. Then $120,000 for the summary judgment motion that failed because the judge decided there were genuine issues of material fact that needed to be determined at trial. Then another $100,000 preparing for trial, hiring expert witnesses who could testify about network security and industry standards, and whether Apex had met its obligations under the contract. My business liability insurance covered the first $500,000, but after that I was on my own. The business operating account, which had once held a comfortable cushion of about $300,000 for emergencies, drained steadily. I stopped taking a salary. I laid off non-essential staff. I deferred maintenance on equipment. I begged vendors to extend payment terms. But it wasn't enough. So I did something desperate, something that, in retrospect, was probably the beginning of the end of my marriage, even though I didn't see it at the time. I remortgaged the house without telling Joanna. I told myself I had good reasons. The business needed capital immediately, or I'd have to shut down and declare bankruptcy. If I declared bankruptcy, I'd lose everything anyway. The business, my reputation, any hope of ever working in the industry again. But if I could just keep fighting, if I could just get to trial or force a reasonable settlement, maybe I could save everything. The house had about $400,000 in equity built up over 15 years of payments. I could take out a second mortgage, get access to that equity, use it to keep the business afloat long enough to win the lawsuit or settle it for something manageable. It made sense in my head. It was logical. It was a calculated risk that any reasonable business person would consider. The office smelled like stale coffee and broken dreams. At 6:30 a.m., I sat under sickly fluorescent light, staring at a $2.49 7-Eleven cupcake with a bent candle I'd dug out of a drawer. 50 years old today, and I couldn't bring myself to light it. What wish was left? I hadn't told Joanna about the second mortgage until after I'd signed, because I knew she'd fight me and I didn't want the fight. That was the marriage-ending mistake. When I told her after dinner, her face went from white to red to white again. "You did what?" she whispered, voice trembling like the wineglass in her hand. "I had to," I said. "If I lose the lawsuit, the business dies. The mortgage buys us 2 years to fight, to settle." "You didn't even ask me," she said, louder now. "You gambled our home, Emily's home, without me." "There wasn't time," I said, and even I heard the weakness in it. "The business pays for everything. Without it, we lose the house anyway." "Then let it die," she shouted. The glass stem cracked against the counter. Red spilled across the marble she'd spent months choosing. "Your company isn't worth our marriage." She grabbed her purse. "I'm going to my sister's." The door clicked shut. Final. After that, absence became routine. Late dinners, weekend trips, a phone always in her hand, laughter she didn't share. At home, she drifted from room to room like a guest. We spoke in logistics. We slept apart. Weeks turned to months without touching, Emily noticed. 13, sharp-eyed, too old to be fooled. "Why is Mom always gone?" she asked over a half-eaten dinner. "I know what divorce looks like." She cleared her plate and went upstairs, closing her door softly, which somehow hurt more than a slam. 18 months later, the lawsuit settled. No admission of wrongdoing, $200,000 from Apex, cash bled from the second mortgage and the last of our reserves. Vendors cut us off. Clients fled. I laid off 30 people I'd hired and trained. My business credit cratered. My name, once a key card, became a closed door. Calls went unanswered. Conferences stopped inviting me. I was being erased from my own industry. Joanna's voice turned clinical. I ran into David Cheng, she said one morning. Palace Verdes, 3.2 million, Ocean View. The comparison drifted across the kitchen like gas. Later, she changed her phone password. She stayed out until 2, 3 nights in a week. One evening, the ring was gone. Cleaning, she said, eyes on her screen. It never came back. So I moved into the office in everything but name. The 24-hour gym became my shower. The convenience store, my pantry. Spreadsheets ran red no matter how I arranged the numbers. Home felt like an exhibit of what I'd lost. Kitchen, parties, bedtime stories, a master bedroom that wasn't mine anymore. The office was at least honest about what it was. And then my 50th birthday arrived. Joanna walked in wearing her gray suit and left a manila envelope on my desk. "Happy birthday," she said, flat. Petition for dissolution of marriage, filed 3 days earlier. She'd waited for today to deliver it, precise, cruel, effective. "You're joking," I said. "Do I look like I'm joking?" She didn't. Sign the papers, I'm done. She called me broke, old, nothing. The words landed like the envelope. Heavy, dusty, final. Hours later, I sat where she'd left me, divorce pages fanned across the desk, the cupcake sweating under the lights. In the glass of my dark monitor, I could see the outline of a man who had run out of explanations. Husband, father, owner, all titles stripped by choices I made and those I didn't. I picked up the candle, straightened the bent wick, and put it back. No wish, no prayer, no bargaining. I slid the papers into a neat stack, uncapped a pen, and signed where my name was printed. There was nothing left to negotiate, no lesson on the other side of this page, no hidden rise after the fall. Just ink, silence, and a door I locked behind me. That was the end.